Where can I stand that's out of the way, Patty? Or sit here? Unless it's... Hi. Good. Oh, I hope I didn't undo my... This is a foreign... This is not a task I'm familiar with. I know, at least there's this thing.
Okay, just keep in mind, everyone on the internet can hear you. Ooh. Hello, welcome everybody. How are we tonight? You guys are very on time, and I appreciate that about you. So give yourselves a round of applause. Way to go. We have a lot of first-timers here tonight, I think. Go ahead and give us a little, wave if this is your first time. Welcome, friends. We're Chicago for Chicagoans. Our fabulous marketing director, Olivia, I'm very sure gave you a lengthy spiel when you got in here about our organization, but I will repeat it. My name is Patty. I'm the founder and executive director of Chicago for Chicagoans. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are all volunteers, so be nice to us. But we're here to make sure that Chicagoans always have a really wonderful place where they can come to learn more about the history of their own city. Since 2016, when we started, all of our programming has been offered on a pay-what-you-can basis. And that's because we also want you to be able to come and learn about Chicago history, even if you don't have that much scratch in your pockets today. History is a human right, so we're here to teach you about it. We thank you for being here. We do lectures all through the winter at the very fabulous Room 13. And then in the summertime, we hit the streets. And we go out and do walking tours all over the city. We have about 30 different walking tours. And the other cool thing that we do is a little program called Tour Guide 101. So we also offer training to any excitable historian or would-be historian or passionate Chicago resident to come and just learn from us. We'll tell you absolutely everything we know about giving tours and public speaking and running a small organization. We really believe that Chicago is better when we have lots of diverse voices telling the stories of our city. And that is exciting to mention because I actually see a few graduates of our program here tonight, so I have to name drop it for sure. We are entirely supported by your generous donations. So speaking of scratch in your pockets, we have lots of ways for you to donate if you have a good time tonight. We accept cash and check and Venmo and Google Pay and Apple Pay and kidneys and anything we can get a good price for on the black market. So please consider making a donation if you can. We definitely enjoy that. And it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who is not only a graduate of the 2022 cohort of Tour Guide 101, she's also been coming to many of our events for a very, very long time. So anytime I see somebody come to a bunch of our events and then show up for Tour Guide 101, that feels like a very deep personal success for me. Like I created a nerd. Or I enabled one. Anyway, it's very, very exciting. So we're extremely happy to have her here. She is an incredible advocate for Chicago's vernacular architecture, but very, very importantly, and this is going to play into her talk tonight, for bikers in Chicago. So we'll have Olivia tag her organization that she works a lot with, Bike Grid Now, on her Instagram, so you can follow them. I just wanted to name drop that. And then I'm gonna, without further ado, give it over to her. So give Emma a nice round of applause.
Thank you, Patty. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Patty did not mention, but this is my very first lecture, so be gentle with me. Really appreciate all your interest and taking the time to chat with me a little bit tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to chat today about historic uses of street space in our beautiful city of Chicago, conceptions of who the street belongs to, what the street is for over time, and how we got to the way our streets look today. So let's go ahead and get started way, way back at the beginning. Who can tell me what our streets were made of at the very beginning of Chicago, let's say around mid-1850s? Mud, indeed. I was hoping someone would say mud. They were made of mud. It was not fun to walk around. That was your only option, though. The richy rich had private horse-drawn vehicles, but everyone else is stuck walking in the mud. By the 1840s, however, the city made its first attempts to harden the roads. The very first early attempts at this looked literally like wooden planks across the roadway here. As you can imagine, those were quickly deteriorated and replaced with more of a parquet woodblock style paving system that persisted well into the 20th century. During the 1850s, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, the city began the process of elevating the street grade. You can see the remnants of this process throughout the city. If you've ever noticed a house whose yard or whose first floor is like sunken beneath the level of the sidewalk, that's how you know where our streets used to be and where they are today. So, like many things in Chicago, this was done on a piecemeal basis by individual property owners throughout the city. So those who lifted their buildings also lifted the adjacent sidewalks and walkways, which left passersby to climb up and down ladders on either end. So at least they were not mud, I guess. After the Great Chicago Fire, more people were living on the streets than ever as they were, temporarily left homeless for months and maybe even years on end. Some say this was our most intensive period of street life in the city of Chicago, increasing innovations on the vehicular side. And as I mentioned, lots of human beings living out on the street full time was causing quite a bit of congestion. So shortly after that, in the 1880s and the 1890s, we had the advent of cable cars, we had trolleys, and then by 1892, we had begun construction on the L system that elevated our street tracks or our public transportation up over the street, making it safe from any congestion at the surface level. Around 1890, pressure was building not only from farmers that needed to bring their goods to market here in the city, but also from recreational bicyclists to harden the streets for the first time. So good to know that we've been loud and annoying for at least the last 140 years. Us and the farmers. That's why we got hard streets after a while. Around the turn of the century, there was a lot being written in consequential pieces of literature about street life here in Chicago. In 1900, Scottish author William Archer proclaimed that New York for a moment does not compare with Chicago in the roar and bustle and bewilderment of its street life. The street was a place for life and for interaction among different classes, often an opportunity or one's only pass at interacting with those in different social classes. As I mentioned, the L was being developed. More affluent Chicagoans literally could ride through and above tenement districts rather than interacting with those at the street level, eliminating their interactions with those of a lower class only to the street trades, which got increasingly formalized. We'll chat about in just a little bit. Street spaces in the late 1800s, early 1900s were also a microenvironment of socialization for Chicago's children. Youth were able to set their own ways, learn the ways of the world, maybe make a few bucks, whatever. Their games and songs were a part of city folklore for decades on end. However, oh, thank you. And now take a first sip if you don't mind. Now we're all thinking about boys selling papes on the sidewalk and stuff. However, youth gangs had begun to dominate, battling for neighborhood territory throughout the city by the mid-19th century. By the turn of the 20th century, there were a variety of reform efforts going on to clean up street life they had identified street life and activities going on in the street as the locus of the city's social problems. So these reform efforts came in the form of truancy, curfew laws. These were aimed at eliminating not only child labor, but also to get kids off the street. So this is when you also see lots of playgrounds being developed throughout the city in our parks to give kids a place to interact with one another that isn't necessarily on the streets themselves. By 1913, we also saw reform efforts targeted more so at street vendors. So by 1913, as I mentioned, all street peddlers and vendors were forced into the Maxwell Street District, which we know as quite a famous commercial row. And at the same time as the development of Maxwell Street District, the enforcement of anti-loitering laws led to several concentrations of transient populations on the north south, and west sides of our loop. So I've painted a picture of a complicated array of street life, and this is before the car. So let's chat about that. Chicago never quite rivaled Detroit as being the nation's auto capital, but during the first decade of the 20th century, no fewer than 28 companies produced 68 models of cars here in the Windy City. We had, quite a strong industrial base that lended itself toward automotive manufacturing and supplying, and again, always supportive of Detroit and a center in its own right for at least a little bit. One of our most famous inventors and manufacturers went by the name of Thomas Jeffrey. His company was initially a bicycle maker, but he created the Rambler, which is one of the earliest automobiles and the most popular automobile developed here in Chicago. I think I've got some pictures on the second slide there. Pretty standard, old-timey car stuff, but I think he's in one of them, so it's kind of fun. Motorists, however, arrived on American streets as intruders. They had to fight to win a rightful place there, and city folk in particular were not necessarily hospitable to the needs of motorists. City people in Chicago saw the car as a menace to life and limb, and as an aggressor to their time-honored rights to city streets. Police and judicial authorities were also quite sympathetic to the time-honored rights of the pedestrian in the streets. A judge at the turn of the century is quoted as saying, "The streets of Chicago belong to the city, not to the automobilists." And I can't believe I've made it this far in a Chicago history lecture before mentioning Daniel Burnham, but we're gonna chat about him. So, professional planners generally saw the automobile as a major opportunity to deconcentrate over-concentrated urban centers. This concentration at the turn of the century was seen as a cause and the environment for a lot of urban ills. And to them, the automobile was the best instrument for accomplishing deconcentration. So Daniel Burnham was no different. His visionary plan of Chicago in 1909, as we all know, I'm sure, created a picture of a city beautiful, called upon civic character to realize that goal, and characterizes Chicagoans as a people who can and will act in the best interest, best public interest to realize that vision. The plan was also a blueprint for providing roads for automobility. Burnham and other contemporaries of his time were visionary and car-loving males. Their designs became the foundation of the American automotive city. So in the plan, there's an emphasis on traffic flow, which necessarily countered the working class and social uses of the street that had been common in Chicago up until that time. As you see, I've included some lovely visuals of the photographs in the plan. These lovely impressionist style illustrations depict Chicago as a celebrational city as if viewed on a warm Sunday afternoon. Notice there are no parking lots, so he didn't really consider that. Burnham's plan, with its unimpeded traffic flows, also represented a transition into the automobile age, which drastically changed the relationship between Chicago's and their streets. The automobile, as I already mentioned, benefited from growing disdain among middle-class reformers and the social elite, disdain for the street, and provided a sense of isolation from street life that had previously only been enjoyed by the uber-wealthy. At the time of Daniel Burnham's release of the plan, there were fewer than 10,000 automobiles registered in the city of Chicago, which is perhaps why popular opinion in the 1920s, particularly in cities, was generally unsympathetic to automobiles. With the sudden arrival of the automobile in cities came a new kind of mass death. Most of the dead were city people, most of the car's victims were pedestrians, and most of those pedestrian victims were children. A lot of city people saw the car as inherently dangerous and ill-suited to the nature of our city streets. As I've already mentioned, pedestrians were anciently and customarily entitled to the whole streets, and that was going to cause some problems, as I'm sure you can imagine. Interestingly, I learned as I was researching for this tour, alongside the advent of the automobile, there were quite a few medical and sanitary innovations and techniques that helped bring down the death toll both in cholera and typhoid fever in the United States. But the death toll from motor vehicle accidents at the same time threatened to entirely wipe out the gains in terms of life expectancy and in terms of raw death toll. Our chief of police in 1910, Chief of Police Stewart, was all about I spent a lot of times in the Chicago History Archives, and he's in all of those articles talking about this campaign to put a stop to the killing and the maiming of citizens by automobile driving, and how there needs to be automatic devices that will shut off or prevent the advancement of vehicles when the speed limit is exceeding. I pulled a couple newspaper clippings from early automobile accidents just to give you a sense of how they were spoken about. Those are all from like 6 weeks in 1910. So you can imagine, number one, the frequency with which this was happening, and number two, how often it was being discussed in the press early on here. In the first 4 years after Armistice Day, more Americans were killed in automobile accidents than had died in the Battle of France. This carnage inspired a safety movement unlike anyone in the U.S. had ever seen before. As I mentioned, in cities in particular, there was a mass constituency for traffic safety, and the frequency of child death immediately gave the traffic safety movement a feminine coloring. Mothers were often standing for the horror of child death, parental bereavement, grieving publicly, and a lot of our early safety movements were not only a public safety campaign, but also an expression of grief and anger. So when personified in art, in cartoons, in anything else, the enemy was death or a reckless driver, almost always portrayed as male. In 1916, Charles Price, who began his career as an industrial safety expert here in Chicago at International Harvester, moved his skills over to the National Safety Council, which is also headquartered here in Chicago. The National Safety Council was quick to begin organizing local councils throughout the country and safety weeks to bring the message regarding traffic safety to more communities throughout the country. By 1921, Price had announced the arrival of a new and giant hazard, calling motor crashes a problem more alarming and more far-reaching than any other in the history of the safety movement. Charles Price did not necessarily have 100% alignment of his rank and file members throughout the country, and those rank and file members of these public safety campaigns often drew their inspiration from human suffering. They strengthened the council's tendency to portray the grim consequences of accidents, both as a practical warning to others and, as I said, a public and emotional expression of the toil of human suffering. They often blamed motorists exclusively and linked the danger directly to speed. While jaywalker became an everyday term at this time to ridicule careless pedestrians, which we will chat about later, these demonic images of traffic safety campaigns exonerated the leading victims, most often children and pedestrians, by putting the caricature instead in the driver's seat of an automobile and by often making the vehicle itself the demon. I tried to find some good demon pictures, but they were all quite blurry, unfortunately. As I mentioned, Americans at this time in the 1910s and 20s publicly grieved children who were killed in street traffic. Early street traffic campaigns were in large part memorials to the dead. In most cities, these campaigns concentrated their attentions on child death and put the burden of responsibility squarely on the motorists. Beneath this grief and anger lie an old assumption that city streets, like city parks, were public spaces and that anyone could use them provided they did not unduly annoy or endanger others. However, under the pressure of worsening street casualties in the early 1920s and continually offended senses of right by pedestrians, disagreements among the diverse promoters of safety grew divisive. Local safety councils tended to focus their efforts on educating school children on traffic safety, who, one, needed the protection, and two, were less likely to object to the infringement of their rights as pedestrians. While educators, in principle, may have held motorists responsible for road fatalities, in practice often worked with children to give them responsibility or some sort of control over their own safety in an attempt to evade this new mass death we're dealing with. Streets were once portrayed as the playground for most city children, but by the 1920s, street games were becoming a high-stakes gamble. Nearly half of the children struck down in city streets during this decade were killed on their own home block. Yes, dark stuff. In other words, businesses also had stuff to say about cars, so let's see what their thoughts were. This is very interesting to me as I was researching this. Chambers of commerce outside of the largest cities were very rare prior to the 1900s, but they quickly proliferated in the 1910s and 1920s because of the automobile. The enemy of business associations was not so much, as we saw on the safety reformer side, accidents, disorder, death, and dismemberment, but congestion. Traffic jams threatened their commerce, their downtown investments. Businesses wanted and needed a way to keep traffic moving, keeping traffic density high while keeping those vehicles moving. What they wanted, in short, was a sense of traffic efficiency. Merchants and businessmen stood to suffer quite a bit from traffic congestion, and they stepped in where city governments could not or would not. In doing so, they changed the prevailing construction of the traffic problem, as initially perceived as a threat to order and a threat to life and limb. It was redefined by businesses and chambers of commerce as a threat to commerce. Downtown businesses, of course, saw traffic as potential business, and as I mentioned, these traffic jams were a threat to the bottom line. They were quick to employ the skills of experts, and this is where we begin seeing what you would consider today as traffic engineering. So engineers at the time were initially contracted by business associations, so therefore paid little attention to safety or to the rights of pedestrians. Rather, the focus was on getting as many cars in and out as possible. As long as those traffic engineers enjoyed the backing of a wide array of business interests, so not only chambers of commerce, but early automobile clubs as well, they succeeded in popularizing and defining traffic as a technical matter for experts only. It wasn't long before we started seeing first attempts at traffic regulation. So, as I mentioned, police typically defended the customary rights of the pedestrian in the early 1900s here in Chicago. It was their intention to not make the streets safe for motorists, but to make them safe from motorists, as the majority of deaths were car on person, which is not an even fight, I wouldn't say. Initially, police responded to the proliferation of automobiles on Chicago streets by assigning cornermen at busy intersections to direct traffic. This proved very expensive and quite dangerous, as I'm sure you can imagine, so they were quick to adjust and find technological solutions instead. So one of our first technological solutions pioneered here in Chicago is called the silent policeman. I've got a photo in the packet, and it's pretty much, to my understanding, a light pole. It goes in the middle of the crosswalk, and you got to slow down to go around it, and you got to make wide left turns, all this good stuff. But it is effectively a light pole. But by 1921, a Chicago company introduced what was called a Milwaukee mushroom, which was sold as a superior variation of the silent policeman. So it's like this little mushroom-shaped hump you roll over, and it's supposed to have the same effect, I understand. Chicago hosted a good roads show, so a trade show on traffic regulation and safety devices in January 1922. Where city officials could evaluate these examples of traffic regulation devices and speak directly to the manufacturers. I don't know really where these manufacturers came from because no one knew what they were doing. Like traffic safety was only, or traffic engineering was only just in its infancy as a field of study. So I don't know who came up with the mushroom, but I have to admire their confidence. There were no traffic studies happening at the time regarding their efficacy. Anyway, there was nowhere in the world more congested than Chicago's Loop District in terms of motor traffic vehicles. In the early 1920s, a full 25% of Chicago's 3 million people entered the Central Business District each weekday, so something was going to have to be done pretty quickly. By 1925, the Chicago Association of Commerce stepped in, and they also turned to traffic engineers. To find a better way, the engineers in the committee organized a street traffic safety committee that linked signals at 49 intersections to nearby timers in and around the loop. They wired these signals to a central electromechanical brain in the basement of City Hall, which gave operators central control to the whole system. And at 8 a.m. on February 7th, 1926, Mayor William Deaver threw a knife switch, starting the system. This solidified Chicago's role as a leader in transitioning to the motor age. It was the first major business district with a interconnected, signalized group of traffic signals at their intersections. So the fight for an automotive future was headed up by increasingly organized automotive interests in the 1920s, but this came amid a popular outcry against the danger of cars to city people. The fight to organize was actually motivated, in fact, by a lack of demand for cars in cities in the early 1920s. You see this in the way that Charles Hayes, the early president of the Chicago Motor Club, spoke. He was quick to warn his friends and his followers that bad publicity over traffic casualties could soon lead to legislation that would render the automobile almost useless in a city context. The solution, Hayes posited, was to persuade city people that, quote, the streets are made for vehicles to run upon. Charles Price comes back. He notes that there's a great danger in large numbers of people beginning to look on the automobile more of a menace than as a blessing. Automotive industry publications were also following this beat early on, and they also warned of traffic congestion's potential to choke off the sale of vehicles and the danger of highway saturation, especially in and around major cities. This saturation crisis, along with the worsening public relations campaign or the public relations problem for the industry, as the number dead in motor vehicle accidents first exceeded 20,000 per year in 1924. The first half of the 1920s, it was a bit of a scramble in terms of organizing motor clubs and other automotive interests for the first time. But by 1924, they had fallen into a nice line of hierarchy under the American Automobile Association. So by 1924, the AAA was now calling this new movement organized motordom. Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover organized the first National Conference for Street and Highway Safety in 1924, which was the first opportunity for a lot of these interests to put their heads together and make sure all of their public relations and lobbying efforts are aligned. So by 1925, just a year later, they were aligned well enough that they could confidently refer to the political power of the automobile. These interests learned to collaborate and compromise among themselves in order to preserve the future of the industry and in order to ensure that there remains enough and increasingly more space for their product on our streets. The sales slump and the public perception of traffic fatalities in 1923 and 1924 helped push auto interests into the field of traffic engineering. The death toll of 1923 and subsequently proposed restrictive measures in relation to that pressed motordom into the traffic safety debate. So who gets a say in traffic safety matters? Early on, it was those business associations and chambers of commerce that wanted to be a leader in this field, but it wasn't long before auto clubs and AAA itself decided that they are the ones to be in charge. It is a function only of an automobile organization to work for safety matters. For quite a long time, the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce was completely silent on the safety issue and the death toll of its product in our cities. After a while, aligned with the AAA, motordom mobilized to join the safety fight and to advance alternative models of traffic safety. We'll chat more about that in just a little bit. But they had some other work to do in terms of reconstructing the accident narrative. So Zach Elkins, another member of the Chicago Motor Club in the 1920s, is quoted as saying, "Every time there's a fatal automobile accident, newspapers play it up with scare headlines and frequently paint the motorist as a bloodthirsty maniac bent on destruction. Motorists are being listed as vampires who annually snuff out the life of some 20,000 citizens." I didn't say it. In response to Zach's or Mr. Elkins' probably very accurate statement here, motordom began promoting its cause in terms of both classical, political, and economic liberalism. Its rhetoric opposed freedom to regulation, individual rights to collective goods, and abundance to efficiency. Motordom also learned to construct congestion not as an excess of cars, but as a scarcity of street space. By 1927, the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce hosted a traffic conference in Chicago, and Motor Age, an industry publication, was happy to report that there was a noticeable departure from prior suggestions of restrictive control to the automobile. Motordom was hard at work reconstructing street casualties so they would no longer be the sole responsibility of motorists or of automobiles. Instead, accidents could be a failure of pedestrians to adapt to a new age or a failure of the streets to adapt to technological process. To exonerate the average motorist, automotive interests redirected hostility to a newly identified minority of, quote, reckless drivers. This is a funny bit. All right, so Studebaker is an automobile manufacturing company. They decided in the early 1920s to finance the Erskine Bureau, which was headed up by Miller McClintock, and which funded scholarships for traffic engineers. In 1926, Studebaker moved this bureau to Harvard University, where it presented itself as a Harvard University Research Institute, seldom, if ever, volunteering that its financial lifeline extended directly to an automobile manufacturer in South Bend. Erskine Bureau eventually grew to become the #1 U.S. authority in traffic control, and as we now know, is a vanguard in the autos industry's fight for more rooms in cities, or for more room in cities to accommodate its products. Graduates of the Erskine Bureau went on to work in cities throughout the country and often presented themselves as unaffiliated with industry. That was not the case. A really cool example of this is Miller McClintock again. So by 1927, he was acting as one of the primary spokespeople for the automotive industry, and was one of the first traffic safety experts with a doctorate in his field. He was insulated, just like the Bureau itself, by a Harvard byline and no obvious affiliation with the industry. But if you compare his quotes from before he started working with the auto industry to after, they're quite interesting. In the early 1920s, McClintock wrote that the automobile is, quote, a waste of space compared to the streetcar. He also described the automobile as, quote, a menace to human life and, quote, the greatest public destroyer of human life. After he started working for the automotive industry, he wrote of the inevitable necessity to provide more room in the streets for automobiles. He called for new streets and wider streets. Moneyed interests. Anyway, they're up to all sorts of shenanigans. Here's another one. So the American City Planning Institute was an established professional association for urban planners. I believe it was founded in the mid-1850s, but they were uninterested in allowing any sort of amateur or any sort of non-professional. So this exclusiveness extended to automotive industry people. So in response, they funded their own less exclusive alternative called the Planning Foundation of America. This foundation straddled the border between a professional association and a congress of interest groups. Unlike the City Planning Institute, the Planning Foundation embraced propaganda campaigns and called for the reconstruction of cities. It called for incorporating city streets into great highway systems. These automotive interest groups, as it is clear now, had discovered their destiny in the 1920s. They understood the threats to the automobile's future in the city, and this shocked them into self-discovery. They found their identity, named themselves Motordom, and saw their common enemy, prevailing constructions of the city street, who belongs there, as well as the issues of safety and congestion. The industry was quick to begin discussing its plans to fight for the future. It hoped to encourage two-car homes. It introduced annual model changes, and it worked to overcome the, quote, used car evil by restricting the sale of those used cars. The AAA was quick to become the leading national supplier of safety education material, upserting the National Safety Council's prior position here, and labored to revise the moral drama of traffic safety. By 1928, AAA began distributing posters to schools and promoted a new and controversial idea that the street is the province of the automobile. I've got some cartoons and the visuals as well. They're a little dark. Awesome. I'm going to take a drink, if you don't mind. Woo-hoo. While everyone's perusing. Awesome. So a change in attitudes, a change in perceptions was already evident here in Chicago by 1918. There was an extension of Ogden Avenue from Chicago to Armitage, which symbolized a new attitude and a willingness to raise existing communities in the quest for efficiency. So this roadway slashed through existing neighborhoods, scaled Goose Island with a giant bridge, and the same attitude that almost any part of the city that has already been built might be expendable was present in early plans for wide, limited access roadways. The idea as a street as a place for getting from here to there was about to triumph here in Chicago. Researcher Paul Barrett found that the problem in Chicago prior to 1930 was not necessarily the superiority of one mode of transportation over others, but of a disappearance of good choices. A different local transit policy would not have prevented the rise of the automobile, he says, but it may have provided alternatives for the urban commuter. Without good choices, the automobile soon became the rational, not radical, and practical alternative for those that could afford it. So around the end of 1920s into the 1930s, as I'm sure you can imagine, public transit was not being funded quite well. At the same time, facilities for the automobile were being publicly subsidized and built around our eyes every day, while, again, mass transit was increasingly unreliable, regulated, and taxed to quite a heavier extent. Let's chat now about parking. So, everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure. Chicago is once again at the center of the universe in this discussion, as we'll get into. A Chicago engineer discussing curb parking complained that a few people can utilize the most valuable street space in our cities practically at will for their own pleasure and convenience, and to the serious inconvenience of thousands of other fellow citizens. Curb parking, engineers agreed across the board, aggravated the problem that they sought most to relieve. A single car can, of course, make a whole travel lane useless. But the parking question divided merchants, the question of whether to curb park or whether to not. Big merchants feared the impacts of deconcentration on their downtown investments, and were more likely to back a no curb parking policy so that traffic could keep moving. On the other hand, small businesses, small merchants in the city were more likely to fight these bans as they thought of crowded curbs as a sign of thriving retail sales. In the early years of traffic control, these engineers persuaded leading downtown businesses to go along with the implementation of parking bans. And in banning curbside parking, Chicago's congested loop district was once again an example and one of the first in the United States to ban this kind of parking. Yes, there was a comprehensive traffic safety traffic study done for the city that had been paid for, once again, entirely by the Association of Commerce rather than the city itself. And this is how we got the advice to ban daytime curb parking. Study results showed that of the 96,000 Chicago shoppers that had arrived downtown per day in 1928, only 1.57 of those reached stores from a curbed park vehicle. So there was initially some hesitation about the institution of this ban. So the city decided to try it for 90 days. And after then, many skeptics were convinced and the ban became semi-permanent. So what is it like to walk around Chicago these days? To many Chicagoans, the coordinated signals were a magnificent fulfillment of the promise of traffic engineering. Newspapers were unanimous in their support and approval for the system, as well as police officials from the traffic department, taxi cab drivers, and individual car operators. Reporters, however, noted that pedestrians were left out of their equations. Many city people faulted coordinated signals for making it more difficult than ever to cross the street. Cars sped along faster, giving pedestrians fewer safe opportunities to cross. And in the Chicago's coordinated system of lights first week, the Tribune reported that, quote, the walker found life one succession of heart thrills, dodges, and jumps. I think heart thrills is right, although I've never heard that term before. The system effectively narrowed the functions of both the sidewalks and the roadway, which forever changed the character of our city streets. Within a decade, streets and sidewalks, which were once venues of myriad public activities as late as 1920s, had largely been redefined as primarily and only for transportation, subject to regulation in the name of efficiency. So Motordom was working on shifting our perception of the city street and who belongs there, and again, working to question who is to blame for traffic fatalities. So in taking the lead on traffic safety, automotive interests never allowed suspicion to fall on the automobile itself. The burden of the safety problem had to be concentrated on individual reckless motorists, careless pedestrians, and poor road design. For the next many decades in a row, these automotive manufacturers and automotive clubs did their best to keep the automobile itself out of safety debates. They needed a way to punish reckless motorists without punishing their vehicle, their product? Found the answer here in driver licensing. So from 1924 on, you see almost unanimous support among automotive interests to back the licensing of drivers who pass driver tests at the expense of the state, of course. They also went to work to redefine demand here. So early traffic engineers by the 1920s, well, in the 1920s, they counted people and weighed the importance of their trips when conducting a traffic study. But within just a few years, they began counting vehicles instead. Another component of reshaping this narrative, this is also a little dark, so let me take a second. In 1926, the AAA magazine American Motorist claimed that motorists who struck children anywhere in the street outside of pedestrian crossings could not be classed among the careless because the drivers had never had a chance to stop. This same author consulted 1924 Chicago traffic fatality records and concluded that, in fact, 62% of motorists implicated in child traffic deaths were innocent.
Wow.
No notes.
Wow.
No notes at all. That same year, Miller McClintock is speaking at a Chicago convention of the National Safety Council, and he says, "We have recognized that in controlling traffic, we must take into consideration the study of human psychology. In pedestrian control, this meant extending ridicule to the pedestrian practices incompatible with the motor-age street." This is where we get the term jaywalking. Advocates of pedestrian control, such as Miller McClintock and other automotive interests, fought to classify the jaywalker as any person who walked anywhere in the roadway, except at intersections at right angles to traffic. Through a joint campaign of both the National Safety Council and the Boy Scouts of America, in the early 1920s, thousands of people who never knew what jaywalking meant have learned the meaning of the word and have learned that this behavior is worthy of ridicule. Additionally, the Chicago Motor Club began buying space in the Chicago Tribune for periodic traffic talks, where it published findings purporting to show that reckless pedestrians caused almost 90% of the collisions between automobiles and people. The solution, they say, don't jaywalk. No notes, once again. 90%. Isn't that something? Close readers of the newspaper, as we all are now, since you've got those clippings I pulled from 1910, perceived quite a distinct shift in tone within months. So after automotive interests began organizing, many suspected that this auto industry's influence was behind the trend in terms of softening the blow to motorists in reporting of traffic accidents. We can also assume that they could threaten to pull ads. If you call out the kind of car, you call out anything that's not so favorable to the people who are paying for your advertising space here. So once again, Chicagoans were quick to complain of pedestrian signals conflicting with turning motorists. At intersections controlled by signals, turning cars often deprive pedestrians of their chance to cross on the green. Even the pedestrian crossing on the green was cut off by cars turning corners, then coming up unnoticed behind them. Pedestrians complained of standing 5 or 10 minutes waiting for a chance to cross where, quote, streams of motorists sped past, quote, utterly regardless of other people's rights. It's like trying to cross to get to the lake from Grant Park. Some things don't change here in Chicago. In the motor age model of traffic safety, pedestrians were just as responsible as motorists for injuries and for accidents. Motordom boldly challenged the majority who blamed motorists alone for the accident toll and won. Again, the AAA was ready to make an accusation by 1926 that the grief, anger, and fear displayed by safety reformers in cities in the early 1920s were quite susceptible to the charge of irrationality. Remember the feminine coloring we mentioned earlier? In 1926, the AAA, in its magazine for members only, attacked such popular superstition as the safety reform movement. And more bluntly, the president of the Chicago Motor Club announced that the day of the emotional sob sister campaign has passed. So, as parents and children themselves were increasingly assigned more responsibility for their safety on what used to be their public space, their neighborhood blocks, etc., young victims of traffic accidents became more like the fatalities in other private disasters. They were mourned behind closed doors, where the, quote, sob sisters were quite less audible. Jumping ahead a little bit, well, not so quite. In 1924, I can't believe this was so early, work began on Wacker Drive, a 2-level downtown motor highway, and by the 1930s, AAA was happy to report that states are taking more responsibility for secondary highways and are assisting municipalities in paying for construction and improvement costs of bypasses and main arteries through cities. By 1939, General Motors was promoting to millions of Americans a future of safe urban highways with segregated speed lanes of up to 100 miles an hour. Chicago engineer explained that the provision of separate routes for high-speed traffic will eliminate all causes of accidents to pedestrians and children because they will not be allowed on the highways. You can't make this up. The expressway system here in Chicago removed much of the traffic from our major surface streets throughout the city and represented the near triumph of the idea of the single-use street, in that the only possible use was for a place, or as a place for cars to drive. Chicago managed to sidestep this ever so slightly by putting a rapid transit line between some of those median strips throughout the city. It's not so pleasant to stand there, as I'm sure you can imagine. Neighborhoods that lay in the way of these planned expressways to the northwest, south sides were now regarded as irrelevant piles of rubble to be, and other transient districts, were flattened to make ways for superhighways. At the other end of the auto commute, the suburbs were booming. The state did not begin a public road program for the suburbs and rural areas until after World War I, and didn't levy a gasoline tax until 1929. By this time, auto registrations in Chicago were increasing at about 30,000 vehicles a year, and the federal highway program for rural and suburban roads began at about the same time. In 1956, finally, the Interstate Highway Act shifted the bulk of the cost to the federal government instead, and enabled the city and county to continue their ambitious road building. So I want to take a step back and flash forward a little bit here. One more quote from Miller McClintock, everyone's favorite. In 1930, he predicted that American cities will be rebuilt completely in the coming decades. He claimed that with these rebuilt cities, Americans could buy 5 million to 10 million more automobiles. The conversion of surface passenger transportation, so trolleys, streetcars, etc., here in Chicago, to motor vehicles was so nearly complete that even though each mile of travel carried only 1/3 of the risk, total death tolls kept rising. So the conversion of surface transportation to the most dangerous possible mode robbed us of all the fruits of making that mode even marginally safer. During the 1950s, the press began to note a loss of neighborhood social life that had traditionally grown out of our public spaces here in Chicago. The front porch, the stoop, which had traditionally fostered neighborhood connection, had begun to give way to air conditioning and television. And in the poorest neighborhoods, unfortunately, high-rise public housing completely destroyed the role of the street in community life. Meanwhile, in downtown, also fell into decline. In the 1960s and 70s, we lost our claim to fame as State and Madison being the world's busiest street corner. Loop department stores were displaced in part by the growth of the suburbs and retail nodes out there. Downtown streets began to empty out after dark, and the Loop began to take on the reputation of being unsafe. Interestingly enough, they used to release movies only at downtown movie theaters, and then at a certain point they decided not to do that anymore, and the Loop struggled because that was one of the only things keeping people downtown, I understand. These theater crowds disappeared, and one of our perhaps perhaps poorly thought out attempts to bring people back to the downtown district was turning State Street into a sort of suburban model pedestrian mall. I didn't get a picture of that, but you should look it up because it failed to bring people back. Interestingly, in the 1970s, public opposition to expressway construction was so organized and so potent that it forced the city and the state to cancel plans to build a crosstown freeway on the west side, and also forced the state to abandon a proposal for a freeway in the Fox River Valley, which is about 30 miles south of downtown. That was in the early 1990s. By the 1990s, Chicago area had 54,600 miles of streets and roads, including 2,500 miles of expressways. By the 90s, again, almost 80% of all commuting was done by automobile. Moving ahead a little bit here, neighborhood block parties and the gradual return of outdoor dining were the first signs of a desire to return to some sort of street life here in the 1980s and 1990s. But this contemporary version of street life only really hints at the rich variety of activities that once went on our city streets. What returned was closer to the City Beautiful movement that Daniel Burnham posits in his plan, and less akin to the workaday intensity of the early 1900s and the way our streets looked before the advent of the automobile. What we see now here in Chicago is a lot of street festivals returning. During COVID in particular, we saw a lot of slow streets, expanded dining, all that good stuff. Hopefully this summer it won't all be taken away from us. We will see. But I would say that this is a bit more of a Disney-fied version of street life, carefully planned, very carefully oriented. There's not really so much random magic involved these days. So, where does that leave us today, everyone? I would like to leave us with the fact that Motordom was quick to organize, quick to understand its interests and its implications for its product on our city streets. It understood right away that the accommodating vehicles on our streets was going to require not only a social reconstruction in terms of public perceptions of who belongs in the streets and what streets are for, but also a physical reconstruction to accommodate their product. So, if its fight is a hard one, it must organize, and Motordom has never not been organized. So, to change a well-entrenched shared technological system and to preserve the change, social groups have to organize. Motordom never forgot this lesson. I'd like to close with one final quote from my beloved Peter Norton here. He says that the automotive city took back much of the freedom that it promised. Through technological innovation, a society that prizes individual liberty can unintentionally curtail it. When street users are free to use cars, the freedom of all street users, including motorists, to use anything else is diminished. A city rebuilt socially and physically to accommodate cars cannot give street users the good choices that a truly free market can provide. Awesome. Who's got questions?
We have an online question we can start with.
Amazing.
Just repeat it before you
Okay.
answer it. Did requiring licenses to drive cause a drop in traffic accidents?
Ooh, that is a good question. I do not know the answer. I don't really even know how quickly the requirements came to be in place. I imagine, knowing the state of Illinois, that it couldn't have moved that quickly, but who can say? It wasn't just night and day that they have driver's tests and people to teach you how to drive. Yeah, that's a good question, though. I can look into it.
Questions?
My question is about roundabouts that still exist in some neighborhoods.
Amazing.
How did that come to be a thing? Were they something else originally?
Ooh,
How
that's
did
a great
that work out?
question. Yeah, absolutely. So we got a question about roundabouts, and they exist kind of piecemeal, as we all like to say here in Chicago. Do you have a particular neighborhood in mind?
Well, there's a lot of them in Rogers Park.
Yes. So my understanding is it's highly localized and up to alders and your particular ward in terms of like safe streets infrastructure and any sort of roundabouts, but I'm not sure exactly when those started being built. Ask your alderman, maybe.
of them as traffic calmers. I've heard them called that.
Yeah.
You know, to stop people from speeding.
Yeah.
Maybe they used to be mushrooms.
Maybe they were
That's what I was
mushrooms.
wondering. As if the
Who can
mushrooms
say?
are related.
Yes.
How do you feel about our current bike path options, specifically the Lakefront Trail and the 606? And do you think we can get more?
That is a great question and one I can't answer. So I was asked about how I feel about the current network of bike options in the city, with particular emphasis on the Lakefront Trail and the 606. I love the Lakefront Trail. It's my very favorite. It would make my heart very happy if there were safer options to get there. Pretty much all of the intersections with Lakeshore Drive are treacherous, dangerous, flooded.
Or encampments.
Yeah, something that you don't want to cross. And it makes my heart sad because I would love to see so many more Chicagoans on bikes, and I think that they would get there if there was a safe and easy way to get to the lakefront. And I think we can get there. The 606 is also lovely, but getting over there is not fun because Chicago is bad at east-west bike routes and not great at north-south ones either.
Maybe they should have a grid.
Yeah, we should have a grid. There's an idea.
Do you want to talk about the slide you included, which is my favorite, which is just pictures of cars parked on sidewalks?
Yes, so you printed it for me.
Can I just say something to that?
Please do.
Today, walking down Clark Street on the way down here, I was walking in front of Sunnyside, and there were police officers writing tickets for 3 cars that had flashing lights in the bike lanes.
Wow.
And I thanked them.
In Wrigleyville?
In Wrigleyville, and I thanked them. And after I thanked him, I told him who I was, and he's like, "Oh yeah, okay." But I was kind of psyched that they were actually ticketing people.
That's-
Poor people who are spending bucks on weed, coming out, find $250 is gone. For me, but,
Yeah, that's an expensive outing.
But, it already gets you bad enough.
Amazing. Was I supposed to talk about something else? I'm sorry.
Yes, you're all of your.
Oh, yes. Okay, so I figured I should include some visuals to tie us back to the current day. Those are all just from my camera roll like the last 6 weeks. I'm just trying to live in the city, walk around, and I'm consistently disrespected for no reason. So I think that things can get better and that we could maybe be more mindful of where we put our giant automobiles because they're only getting bigger, folks. So something to consider.
Hey, Emma,
Yes.
you talked about at the end of that, you talked about the Prairie Parkway, which is the one in Kane County that, like in the 90s,
Yes.
people were talking about it. Well, I think it's
Jack
still
works
like
at IDOT.
No, don't tell me. Until about 2 years ago, I knew a number of people who were still advocating for that project.
It never happened.
It hasn't. If there are certain people you ask, they say it's still happening. And it's like, no, we don't need
Your boss?
No, not my boss. No. These are people in these areas that really want it, right? Because it's going to bring jobs and investment.
I see.
It's not.
That's always the argument. It'll bring other stuff too.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's the J in jaywalking?
Yes, yeah. The J in jaywalking, I think that before the term, a J was just like a dope. Is my understanding, or like a hick maybe would be.
Like a country bum.
Yeah, a country bum. Which is funny because it was like an assault or an insult hurled at city folks, primarily, I would imagine. But
Well, your country if you're walking. If you're running a car, you're nothing.
it's true.
So true.
It's true. Got another online question?
No, I just have a question.
Please.
So I was reading about like all the investment that they're doing in electric vehicle charging stations, which is being paid for predominantly by auto manufacturers. And I just wanted to know if you are getting any like heated flashbacks to sort of seeing the way that electric vehicles are being implemented by adding all this infrastructure with private companies.
Yes, that is a great question about electric vehicles and their future in our city more generally, I would say. I would say that EVs are meant to save the automotive industry and not the planet, most generally. And also, EVs are just as, if not more deadly to pedestrians and people outside of cars. So doesn't really solve most of my gripes, but I'm an annoying bike person, so who can say? I have concerns about charging cables in the sidewalk, but luckily I haven't come across that yet. Don't know if anyone else is jumping over cables on a daily basis because their neighbor has a Tesla or whatever, but haven't had to suffer it yet. What's up?
Can you speak about how we got bike lanes? Like you have all these old photos of streets and there's no bike lanes.
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't actually do a ton of research on this, and I don't know a ton, admittedly. Someone who's been in Chicago longer than me could probably tell a better story. But I imagine it was the annoying bike people, just like in the 1890s.
Leland was the original greenway.
Yes.
Leland was the original greenway that went towards the lakefront from Clark, right through my neighborhood.
There you go.
Yeah. But it's now a semi-route at the end of it.
For some reason.
That's because they redid the Wilson Avenue stop, and you can't drive a semi into Lawrence.
I see.
That's why there's no speed bumps or pedestrian bump outs or anything there.
And Leland used to be a slow street during COVID.
Yeah.
No longer.
Oh, they eliminated that?
Well, it came back with like fewer cones for a year or two, and now I don't think it'll come back at all.
No.
Yeah.
Poorly.
Admittedly, the residents on that street were furious.
Yeah,
Not
people
me.
love
I
their
live on-
parking.
I live a half block away from that, and most of the residents that lived on Leland between Clark and Sheridan loved it.
Oh, really?
They hated the fact that trucks are using in front of Christopher House, where the where that daycare center is. People hate the fact that cars use it as a throughput. There's one individual that I know quite well that drives a little Audi who drives from west of Western all the way to the lakefront on Leland and blows off stop signs routinely
Yeah.
and has gunned it when she's seen me specifically because I've given her shit.
That's the case on Wilson. Being a former resident of Wilson Rockwell, I can totally verify it's on Wilson. It's a real fun stretch for folks that don't
So,
get to learn.
not to delve too deep into specific issues with your own block, but
Please.
I am wondering if you would like to speak to what your idealistic utopia of urban streetscape is.
Me? That's so nice. I would say, as a woman, it would be lovely to see more women being comfortable and other non-men generally comfortable riding their bikes, walking, etc. For lots of people, getting into a car doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like the only safe, rational option, especially in neighborhoods with less transit accessibility. So anything we can do to help people feel safe and confident and not like they're about to be run over by their neighbor would be my version of utopia, because having to feel like you're going to be run over by your neighbor every time you leave your house is not peace, and we deserve better. Yeah. I love your glasses.
Thank you, Zenny. I was wondering if you could speak to how, if at all, self-driving cars may be changing the
Everyone's asking me the big questions today. That's a great question. I'm hesitant because they don't have a good track record for understanding the complexity of human movement, I wouldn't say. But I think we're kind of a long way off from having to deal with that, if I'm honest. But I don't know.
until another 20,000 people die.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty constant these days. We've normalized it to a shocking extent. Well, yeah, we'll see. It can't be better than it is now, I don't think. But I'm no autonomous vehicle expert, admittedly.
So do you think with things like what's going on now with the Chicago community kind of coming together and realizing, crap, last year was horrible.
Horrible.
We need to fix this. And a lot of disparate groups got together and started pushing the mayors and started pushing things, and now things are happening. Like, is this, I don't know, I'm kind of hopeful for my own reasons, but like, do we all feel that this is something that can be done? Like, I think it can be done with everything that is starting. I think that there are certain mayoral candidates may help, may not help, but like, do you think it's something that can be achieved? Like, population peak in Chicago is 3.6 million people. We're at 2.6 million, but we lost 1 million but gained 500,000 cars. That's a problem.
Yeah. I do think it's possible. I remain optimistic. I think a primary takeaway I'd like for everyone to have from all of this information I just threw at you is that streets are malleable. They haven't looked this way forever. They didn't look the way they did before the advent of automobiles forever. Things can change. And as I said, it takes organization and both physical and social reconstruction, again, of who belongs on city streets, what they're used for, what they look like, and what we deserve.
What a nice way to end.
Yes. Thank you all for listening to me.
I'm going to ask people for money now.
Of course. You can have the mic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed our fabulous talk. Again, this is Emma's first lecture with us, so thank you for giving her a nice warm welcome. And keep in mind, keep in mind that you too can sit up here next year and tell us all about your passion with Chicago and city history. Finally, a friendly reminder, we are an all-volunteer organization, tiny but mighty, and if you have a little money to donate tonight, we certainly appreciate it. Other than that, we will be back here next week and the week after that for some incredible more lectures. Erica will be joining us to talk about abandoned transit routes, very topical connection to tonight. We'll be talking about Pullman in a few weeks, so if you haven't already grabbed your tickets, make sure you grab those because they are selling out fast. All right, thanks. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
So I've been.
Oh, thank you, Patty.
So semi-structured under track. But they try so hard and fail.
Yeah, I'm in.
Okay, so